So we've been looking in the book of Genesis at the Nephilim, and this is part 9 of that series. And tonight we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 11, read verses 1 through 9. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city, and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So we've been looking at the fallen angels and Nephilim, the giants, the flood, and the other parts of the biblical narrative that runs from beginning to end of the Bible narrative as a whole. It all goes together. Today, we're going to look at the debacle that occurred at the Tower of Babel. In the above passage, we see that they're building a tower in the land of Shinar, and this is the same as the Akkadian Sumer, from which we get the English Sumer, so the Sumerians. Now, we looked briefly at Nimrod last week, and he was the ruler of this region, ruling from his capital, Erech, which to the Sumerians was Uruk, from which we get the word Iraq. So it's obvious that languages change, but we can trace the words in the way that they're used in most cases. Now, in the first verse, we're told that the whole earth, that is, the entire human population, was of one lip and one vocabulary. They had been told to replenish the earth, and some probably did follow directions. However, the vast majority seems to have remained together. This unity of language descended from the original human pair. I imagine that there were different accents, but they had one language. Even today, we can trace much of our language back to that origin, which can give us an understanding and connection between our modern languages and ancient languages. Even when they don't seem to be the same at all, there are traces that are left in those languages. Myself, I speak only English with a few phrases of other languages sewn in, but others who are fluent in multiple languages can evaluate these connections much easier. There's a sort of a genealogy of languages if you write it down. In the land of Shinar, any major works that were undertaken would be given to Nimrod for credit. When it says that Nimrod built Babel or Nineveh, it does not mean that he used his own hands to build every aspect of it, only that he was the originator and the driving force of it. Now, generally, if a leader didn't finish a work that they started, they were not acknowledged for that work. And this is why he is not credited with the building of the tower here. However, this event is of such momentous importance that we're given the information. So anytime that we get something that's out of the ordinary or something that's weird, we should pay attention to it. Now, most people know the idea of the Tower of Babel. People who have never opened a Bible know of the story of the Tower of Babel. And those who learn the story as children, they remember the story. But most people don't pay that close of attention to it. But there's also a city that goes with it, not just the tower. Now, although the city is associated with the tower, the city and the tower are separate, and that's going to come back into importance later. The Bible tends to view cities in a negative light. It's kind of like I do. I prefer to stay out of the cities. Well, God told them to spread out and not gather up in the cities. Now, being able to communicate is necessary to the construction of anything or construction of society or to civilization in general. And in this instance, here in Babel, the construction of the city, which was the center of the civilization, and the tower had to be able to communicate. So this was a very massive undertaking that everybody there was involved in, and it was only possible if everyone had a good understanding of the directions and they were able to work toward a common goal. A good example of what happens to a massive undertaking if there's not a common understanding, even a relatively minor understanding, is with the Mars Climate Orbiter. It was supposed to orbit Mars and study the climate, but it entered the wrong trajectory and entered the Mars atmosphere. And the problem was that Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, they were in charge of navigation. They used the metric system. And Lockheed Martin used standard or the English measurements, and there was a miscommunication. Now, while metric makes more logical sense, the English, which used feet, pounds, inches, things like that, is actually based on ancient measurements based on a biblical standard that is well beyond the scope of the study. However, Lockheed Martin, they used the measurements in standard. They didn't convert it correctly to metric. A few $100 million down the drain just because of miscommunication. So communication is necessary to any large undertaking. Now, there are many Bible scholars that think that it was just the line of Shem that was involved in this because this narrative occurs in the middle of the genealogy of Shem's line. However, Nimrod is not of the line of Seth or Shem. The people inhabiting the area are not listed as being of the same line, and this narrative was inserted into the middle of this narrative at a later date, probably during the Babylonian captivity, and it was put there for a reason. Now, chronologically, the account would have occurred between Genesis 10:10 and 10:11, but it was probably inserted here during the Babylonian captivity. And inserted does not mean that it was simply made up and added, only that it was a separate narrative that they put into the narrative and put it into the text at this point here. So the captivity in Babylon coincided with Nebuchadnezzar II's refurbishment of a local ziggurat in Babylon that was named Edaminonki. Now, it's no longer in existence. I took a picture of this off of Google Maps to show where it was. This is what the parking lot looks like now. But many people think that the biblical account of the Tower of Babel was based on this worship structure here. However, the tower that was there reinforced to the Israelite mind the image of the much more ancient tower that was associated with it. After all, other than their oral traditions, which were written down at a later date, they only had the stories because no one had ever seen it. They could only say, oh, this huge tower. They couldn't picture it. Well, during the captivity, they saw this tower. They had an idea of it. Now, this tower here, Edaminonki, was not as impressive as the original Tower of Babel, but it was an image and it was a type. And Alexander the Great, when he came through and conquered this area, he had commanded that it to be rebuilt. He came back a while later to check on it. They hadn't started on it, so he commanded it to be destroyed completely during the 4th century BC. So there is nothing remaining of it. It was taken down to the ground. So if we read this narrative of the Tower of Babel where it belongs chronologically, between Genesis 10:10 and 10:11, it makes it obvious that Nimrod became known as the Assyrian after the Babel debacle. And this is going to be important later. We're going to be reading a lot here, but this is going to be important later, so remember this. But when the narrative of the Tower of Babel is read between these passages, we get the following. This is going to be the entire story here. This is Genesis 10:8 through 10, chapter 11, 1 through 9, and chapter 10, 11, and 12. So Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick, and let us burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. From that land he went into Assyria, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is, the great city. So reading it this way shows us later connections that are not now obvious. Nimrod rose to power in Shinar. He built the city and tower. He was exiled to Assyria, and then rebuilt his empire. So it makes sense to read the story this way. But why was it later inserted into the middle of Shem's genealogy? It's because the author, in writing it down, is contrasting the line of Shem with the builders. It's a contrast. This is important. It's in the wrong place in order to show us something that's very important. And if this is so important, why is Nimrod not named as the one who is responsible for the tower in this narrative? We don't find it out till later. As we've looked at in the past, most people skip over genealogies. After all, they're just a list of names, and that's not important, right? Wrong. They're here for a reason. This narrative of Babel is in a series of genealogies, and suddenly this section has no names. Putting it in the middle of the genealogy of Shem makes this very apparent. You're getting name, story, and then back to the names again. Not a single person is named in connection with Babel, and this was done because every single person who is responsible is a disgrace. If you do something worthy of recognition, then you're going to be remembered. If there are no names, it distributes the blame. The genealogies, they give the contrast that lets everyone know that this tower was not a good thing at all. Now, in chapter 10, Nimrod was a dominant character. He had a lot of power. And that separation removes his glory because he was the one who was primarily responsible for this debacle. Do you notice anything else is missing? There are no descendants listed for Nimrod. After Babel, we pick up the people of the name, and that's what the name Shem means, is name. The descendants of Shem are portrayed as virtuous. They're the people of the name as contrasted to Nimrod and those who joined him. So the plain of Shinar was chosen as the location of the city intentionally. It was not just some random place that they stumbled across and they said, I'm tired of moving around and camping. Let's build a city and a tower here. I don't want to move anymore. They were looking for it. From a physical standpoint, in this location, there was plenty of building materials. They had the tar pits from which they could get the bitumen to cement the bricks together. And the plain had rivers on both sides, so there was plenty of silt left over from the flood where they could make bricks. The bricks would have been naturally white in color, but they would have been glazed. And tradition teaches that they were glazed in different colors for each different level. In other words, one level would be this color, next level this color. It was probably, stunning in appearance if that's true. But the bricks would have been porous. And when that is combined with the bitumen from the tar pits, they would have been harder than stone when the whole thing solidified. So the city and the tower are mentioned together twice as a pair in this narrative, but the third mention just talks about the city and not the tower. The first place, and they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower. Then again, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. And then so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. No mention of the tower there. So in our English tradition, we call it the Tower of Babel, but that was not his name. That was his title. So just as Nimrod is a title of mocking and derision and not a name, Tower of Babel is a title, not a name. Luke chapter 14, verses 29 and 30. It says, less haply, which means otherwise. So otherwise, after he hath laid the foundation, and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. It is talking about a man that started to build a tower and couldn't finish it. In Hebrew, the word Babel simply means confusion. However, it's not there simply to make fun of the unfinished building. It's more than that. So, what are the implications of its construction? The Bible tells us that the tower was intended to reach into heaven. Now, these people weren't stupid. They didn't think that they could literally climb the stairs and get to heaven and poke God in the eye if they simply built it high enough. They didn't think they were inside of a snow globe and just climb up high enough and you can get on the outside of it. It was tall, but it was representative of power and dominion. It's what today we call a stepped pyramid of many levels upon which was built a temple at the top to worship particular gods. And we see these all over the world. Many of them are still intact. But this was built to worship a god, and it was not the God of the Bible. From history, we know, from Sumerian history, we know that it was to worship Enki. The Sumerian name Enki means Lord of the earth or God of this world. The worship of Enki involved offerings of fish. He was known as the crafty god. He was always portrayed as the one who had the interests of humans at heart. He had good intentions. Does that sound familiar? Well, which road is it that's paved with good intentions? When he was known as the crafty god, crafty is a word that describes somebody else in the biblical narrative. This person insisted that God was hiding secret knowledge from humans because he didn't want them to become gods. This was a serpent in the Garden of Eden, or the plume serpent. He was crafty. Now, although we can't know for certain, the Tower of Babel is most likely the ziggurat at Eridu, which was named Iapsu. This name means house of the deep waters, which is why fish were offered. This ziggurat, or this pyramid, or this temple, it meets the archaeological requirements of the biblical account of the Tower of Babel. The structure was huge. There were many relics of lost civilization, such as pottery, that was unique and unknown elsewhere, and it was found there. This tower was never completed, and the site was abandoned. It's still there today. You can go see it. The unique pottery didn't appear anywhere else, and then all of a sudden it was everywhere all over the ancient Near East. Almost like people were suddenly scattered, and they left, and they took their styles with them, something like that. But this time period is known to scholars as the Uruk expansion, when the time was characterized by sudden migration out of Eridu for some unknown reason. They don't know the reason, but we're told the reason. God scattered them. The evidence is there that the scattered groups lived in segregated communities for the first time in history where they settled. Groups who could not communicate with other groups had to stick together, and they had to share resources if they were to survive. Now, while we're looking at this dispersion, I want us to take a really short side trip here. This is something to keep in your mind. It's important here. It's going to be more important later. But the confusion of languages was a miracle. Now, as modern people in this world, modern Americans in particular, but anywhere in the world, the idea of a miracle has been redefined for us by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant defined a miracle as something that's impossible, and that's the way most people use it today. However, it's more appropriately something that is possible but very unlikely, that is controlled by a supernatural being. After all, the magicians in the Temple of Egypt, they were able to copy all the miracles that were performed by Moses, and the exception to this is the creation of life, which they could not duplicate. Therefore, the creation of life is something that is impossible through natural means. But generally speaking, a miracle is something that's just very unlikely, and that God makes it happen. In other words, God's power was making something happen that would be humanly impossible, but naturally possible, no matter how unlikely that was to occur. An example of this would be the quail in the wilderness. Great flocks of quail descend on areas on a somewhat regular basis. But what made it happen at that time and in that place? God made it happen. It's the power of God that controls nature. Now, there have been medical cases in which people have received electrical jolts, or they've had head injuries, and upon awakening, they discover they speak a new language that they never knew. In one recent case, a 15-year-old soccer player received a head injury, and when he awakened from his coma, he spoke fluent Spanish. And he spoke only Spanish. He forgot English. Prior to that, he had only spoken English and a few words of Spanish. He's never learned Spanish, but he spoke it fluently when he awakened that. Over time, he regained his English and he lost his Spanish. There are many cases where people have received electric shocks. They start speaking with foreign accents, sometimes foreign languages they've never used. And I think that that is an image that is used here in this. When the languages were changed, it was not just simply, boom, it happens. There was something there visible to go along with it. But there was some sort of trauma that made these people start speaking all other languages. And it's also been shown that certain demeanors and certain behaviors go along with certain languages. So those whose language have been changed through trauma will often have personality changes that revert if their language reverts. So why do different people groups behave differently? And it all seems to be tied in together. Also, different languages process differently in the brain, which also could explain cultural differences. There's a lot going on here that explains changes just with one change by changing the languages. But this should bring to mind the day of Pentecost, in which lightning apparently, or electricity, something apparently landed on many people and they suddenly spoke or understood other languages. I think it's kind of, Pentecost is a kind of a reversal of Babylon. But that study is actually for another day. I just wanted to do a little side trip on this about the whole circumstance. Why did everything change? Why did it change back? But for now, we're going to get back to the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. This verse shows us the purpose the tower was built. It was to make a name. Does that sound familiar? Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And this word literally means mortals of the name. Same thing. Genesis 11:4 is literally saying, let us make ourselves into the men of renown. They're tying this together here, and they're doing it on purpose. This is a powerful message. If you don't find this powerful, then you need to reread the entire narrative. The last time in the Bible that someone said, let us make, it was God himself speaking to his divine counsel of his intention of creating mankind in our image and in our likeness. So when they were attempting to do, or what they were attempting to do, was to give themselves divine power. These humans wanted divine power. They were overstepping boundaries that they were not to overstep. And read this whole passage again. It's not just empty words. God was not upset that they were saying something. God was upset and had to stop them from doing something. Nimrod knew the stories from before the flood. Yahweh had brought the flood to destroy the Nephilim. And no matter how powerful they were not immortal and they could die. Nimrod wanted to avoid the same fate that had destroyed them. The tower was not used for storage. These towers were generally solid. And it was not just to show off to their neighbors how high they could build, but it was to remain above the potential floodwaters. And not only was it tall, but it was made of clay bricks and bitumen or pitch. The basket that Moses was put into and Noah's Ark, they were both sealed within and without with this stuff. In other words, the tower was waterproof. It was built in such a way that they could defy not only the commandments of God, but they could defy the power of God. It says, lest we be scattered abroad. They were not going to do what he told them to do, and they were determined that there was nothing he could do about it. When we look at the pyramids of Egypt, which Nimrod is credited with building the Great Pyramid, but there's a contrast. The pyramids on the Giza Plateau in Egypt are built from cut stone. The Tower of Babel was intentionally built to be waterproof. In the Great Pyramid, the king's sarcophagus, which was never held a body, it just coincidentally happens to be the exact dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. And perhaps if the way tradition holds that Nimrod built it, this was his first attempt at achieving godhood. So it's not the first time that this has happened. But this brings the question to mind that if you want to avoid flood, why not on the top of the mountain? Why would you build in a floodplain? Because a mountaintop would not hold a structure of this size. A structure of this size requires a wide, flat base upon which to build. And the protection offered by the tower was not its location, but what it was made of. In order to get the necessary foundation, they needed to be on bedrock, and so they were usually built upon the ruins of other structures that had already dug down to that bedrock. When it says they found a plain in Shinar, the implication is that they were looking for something. Seek and ye shall find requires seeking. You have to know that you're looking for something to find it. You don't just accidentally stumble upon it. So either the people were looking for an area that met certain criteria, or they knew stories from prior to the flood about structures that were built in the time of the Nephilim. I favor the latter explanation. Job presents this latter idea in Job 3:13 through 14, in which he talks about kings who rebuilt ruins for themselves in order to give themselves a legacy in the land of the living. But it's not merely my preference based upon opinion, but based upon evidence. Part of that evidence is in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year of the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. So this expression dried up is a Hebrew word karab that means ruined or made desolate. And many people think that Nimrod built this tower to worship Yahweh. A ziggurat was built in order to provide a home for the god that it's designed for. As an elevated temple, the god would be invited down to live among the people, and therefore the people would be blessed. That was not Nimrod's intention. He was defying God. He was not trying to bring God down to earth. He was trying to bring his gods up to take their habitation. That goal was already becoming a reality, even though it was not yet finished. So this combination of city and tower was intended to be a gateway to the spiritual realm. It was not used to communicate upward, but to connect with the underworld, the world of the dead. Nimrod wanted nothing to do with Yahweh, the God of Israel. This imagery here is given in the Bible as well as in the Mesopotamian traditions. Some gods were not in heaven, but were in the cosmic waters under the earth. Enki, the god that we're talking about from the Mesopotamian tradition, he did not live in heaven. He was under the earth. And the fact that the tower was tall had nothing to do with the direction that Nimrod was trying to reach, because these gods are chained in Tartarus. These ziggurats were built in order to represent mountains, and that's why they were thought of as suitable places for a god to dwell. A deity who is already above the earth doesn't need a mountain. You build a mountain for a god who wants to move upward. Nimrod was going to build a temple to contact the gods as he had done before, how he became a Nephilim. But this time it would be massive. He would not merely transform himself into a Gabor, but he would transform the entire population. Genesis 11:6, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. So here's our word kalal again. And remember, it means to desecrate or defile. It's the beginning of desecration. Nimrod's intention was to bring back the sons of God into the bodies of human beings. God had destroyed them, and Nimrod was going to undo that. And this had been started in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, and Nimrod was going to finish the job. Now, Mesopotamian writing taught that the creation of mankind was to provide habitation for the gods. Nimrod wanted humankind to achieve the attributes of the gods not by inviting them into the temple, but into the people themselves, into their very souls. And that's why God came down. He was not invited down so that they could worship him. The people had built the tower in order to have a supernatural encounter, and they got one, but it was not the one they were looking for. It's not the one that they were expecting. Acts chapter 7, verses 48 and 49. Howbeit, the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet. Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will you build me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? So God knew that the tower had not been built for him, not that it mattered because he didn't need it, but the people had built a temple in order to glorify themselves, and they believed that gods would restore them as giants into the power they once held. That's why God responded as he did. God knew what had started to happen to the people in Babel. They were united as one. And once the practices that Nimrod had started came to fruition, they would be powerless to resist. This demonic possession can change a person physically. Nimrod is an example of that. He's doing this to everybody else. There would be no escape for the people. If they finished their goal of restoring the fallen sons of God to power, then humanity would be in control of the spirits of the dead forever. They would be changed from the image of God into an image that's unredeemable. It would have corrupted the image of God. It would have been an abomination. And God would not have been able to save mankind, and he would be a liar. And God is not a liar. So he took care of the problem. It says that now nothing will be restrained from them. This doesn't mean that nothing will be impossible for them, as some versions mistranslate it. It implies that their desires will be accessible for them to accomplish. The power of the people to achieve the ends they imagined were significantly greater than that of any ordinary humans. In other words, the supernatural had moved their natural limitations out of the way. They were going to be able to achieve more. Their intentions were evil. And that's what's indicated by the language that's used. The people were actively pursuing a goal that would change them into something completely evil and very powerful. God was not simply being mean and removing their freedom of choice. He was stopping evil. The fallen sons of God were continuing to work from their imprisonment, and this was an act of mercy on the part of God. In Genesis 11:5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men had builded. They were children of men. They attempted to become gods, but they're sons of the ground. They're sons of Adam. They were mortals. The Greek word gigantes means born of the earth, but the word Babylon means change. And the name is a play on words. In Sumerian, Babylon means the gate of God. But in Hebrew, it's from the word Baalal, which means confusion or mingle. It's a change from order. It's a mingling of things that don't need to be mingled. It's not good. But the flood, the great flood, or the flood of Noah, was a judgment upon the fallen sons of God, not upon men. Babel, on the other hand, is a judgment upon men, not all men, but just those who had forsaken their status as representatives of God. They had changed, or they had mingled in a way that was very destructive for humanity. They had denied Yahweh, and they had gone so far the other direction that they had tried to change their own human form in order to attain glory for themselves. Genesis 1:28. This is in the garden. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And then Genesis 9:1. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. When God divided the language of men, it drove them apart. It made it much more difficult to bring about this evil. Didn't make it impossible. There was always been people doing this. But it forced mankind to obey God's command that he had given twice to spread out. He had told them to spread out and not together in cities. And also, it should be noted that man was given dominion over all the earth except in one area, and that's other men. Man is not given dominion over other men, but yet that's the goal of almost every politician out there. When God stopped construction of the tower, This preserved the people alive, as opposed to the flood that destroyed all flesh. A universal catastrophe would not have worked in this instance because we're told, or we're not told, of any who are righteous who could be preserved to start over again. Not all the world was unredeemable at this point, but they had a common intent to make themselves unredeemable. The confusion of languages was a miracle in itself. As mentioned earlier, most languages on earth can be tied together. There's one exception to that, and that's Sumerian, the language of Shinar. It is not tied to any other language anywhere in history. Not only that, there is no Sumerian history, only a legacy. We know nothing about where they came from. We just know what happened afterward. They just appeared out of nowhere as a mighty civilization. In Genesis 11:7 says, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." And this word understand is key to understanding this here. Understanding is a process of interpreting the information we receive in a way that it makes sense to us. We hear words and we hear phrases, and our brains interpret that and makes it so that we can understand the meaning. Interestingly, our brains actually interpret words in a different time than it interprets phrases, and that's how our brain puts the whole thing together to give us a complete understanding of what's being said. In the Hebrew, the word that's translated as understand is the word shama, which means hear. God gave them different languages that they could not understand and they could not hear. They could not receive one another's words. This was an act of disinheritance. This rebellious human family has now been turned over to the gods that they sought, and those gods are the rebellious sons of God. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 through 20. "Unless thou lift up thine eyes into heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the hosts of heaven, shouldst be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as you are this day." And then Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, and this is out of the English Standard Version. "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage." Humanity wanted to obtain the power of the gods for themselves, yet they're now sentenced to serve under those gods. And instead of receiving glory, that glory would be taken from them. Confusion of the languages was not a judgment. And the dispersion itself, the spreading out, was not a judgment. Those were acts of mercy. The judgment was the placement of the fallen sons of God over the nations. Psalm 82 describes the corruption of those gods, but outside of Genesis 6, there's no other mention of angelic sin. The divine rebels were not just locked away to await judgment, but they were sentenced to govern those that they had led astray. They were responsible for leading the people to a knowledge and worship of Yahweh. But all they achieved was further condemnation on themselves by leading the nations into more evil and more corruption. And it's not just the people who were given over to suffer the consequences of the desires, but it was the sons of God as well. The power that they craved would become their condemnation. Not all the sons of God became corrupt, but the ones that were placed in authority over the nations were the same ones who sinned in Genesis 6, except for Michael, who was placed over Israel after it came into existence. There is no evidence that the faithful sons of God were placed over nations at that time. None of the nations worshiped Yahweh except for Israel. All the others failed to rule the nations in a way that brought them to a knowledge of Yahweh. So this approach demonstrates the consistency in the way that God works. When the children of Israel wandered in the desert, they complained until God gave them what they asked for, and it was a judgment against them. Psalm 106, verses 13 through 15. "They soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert, and he gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. Romans chapter 1, verses 20 through 28. Once again, this is from the ESV. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. Have you ever heard the expression, be careful what you ask for because you just might get it? These two passages are prime examples of that warning. And Romans 1, 20 through 28 ends with, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. This can be compared to what we find in Genesis 6, 11, and 19. In both places, we see idolatry, false teaching, sexual abomination, and judgment. Those are the same things that we see in the world today. The sins of the fallen sons of God are seen when the truth is changed into a lie, causing the depravity of human imagination, and they fall further into the vile affections of women who acted against nature. These women were seduced by the watchers. Then later at Sodom, we also see that men have become to pursue these unnatural relationships because they showed clear intent to have homosexual relations with the angels, even going so far as to refuse the daughters of Lot. Demons, as we're going to see in the future, they're also transgender, which ties into this whole mess that we're in today. At Babel, they completely forsook Yahweh. Romans 1 tells us that God judges people by simply letting them have their own way and leading themselves to destruction. Reprobate mind has to do with judgment that does not have discernment. You have to have discernment as a Christian. We're going to read Psalm 82 here. This is a psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So these corrupt sons of God have misled the nations. And the psalmist here is praying for God to bring all nations under his dominion rather than the watchers. These rulers are not humans. Humans may be their puppets, but the ones who have the real power, they're in the heavens. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, God gives the Israelites a king as judgment. And he gave that because they rejected his divine rule. The men who have left Egypt did not see the land flowing with milk and honey, but their children did. Abraham was called out of nowhere after the world had united and rebelled against God at Babel. Abram was an Amorite, yet God, who creates from nothing, called him out in order to establish a people of his own, and God's plan of redemption would be carried out through him. This would bring the nations back. And none of this is new information. I'm not coming up with anything new. I haven't found anything amazing. This is old information that we've just forgotten in the church today, in the modern. This is the understanding that ancient Israel held. But it's a view that most of those in the modern church have lost, not just some. Yahweh judged the world and he dispersed the nations under the authority of the sons of God. In the modern church, we're usually taught only that there was a single event in Genesis 3 that caused all the problems in the world. And while this event is the core problem, it doesn't end there. The continuation is usually ignored. They skip over those verses, they don't like them. But there was a series of rebellions that led to the depravity of the world. And there are three events that contributed to the problems of this world. One was the fall. Adam was responsible, but the serpent instigated it. It was kind of a complicated event, but we all familiar with that. That's usually as far as anybody goes. But then there's the fall of the angels. The angels taught arts to humans that God intended them to not have. They also had forbidden offspring with women, and this brought the Nephilim and their defilement of humanity. And the last is the fall of civilization. Humans wanted to be gods, and they built a city, and they brought about the fall of civilization. And in each of these falls, there is the desire to gain power and knowledge that is in the divine realm, not in the human realm. The serpent promise said, "You shall be gods." And this not only served to point out how much humans lacked divinity, but how much they wanted that divinity. They wanted that godlike power, and the sons of God gave it to them. But it cost them their humanity, and this nearly destroyed the ability for God to bear God's image. Nimrod offered the world the ability to merge human and divine and restore the glory days, like the good old days. It never quite made it to glory. The events at Babel not only attempted to bring about the giants, but it did actually bring about the worship of corrupt deities. And that worship may have been present prior to the flood, we're not told, but we can witness that it has been present ever since. And it's in the world to this day. Babel corrupted the ability for men to bear the image of God into a focus of the powers of darkness. Mankind, by and large, is no longer allied to his creator. Nimrod wanted power, but this evil genius did not originate with him. He didn't come up with the idea. He wanted to be a god, but he's only remembered as a failure. He tried to make his mark at Babel, but he failed. In the Cuthaean legend from Samaria, it states that Enmerker, who is Nimrod, disappeared. It says he was the king of Uruk, and he consulted great gods, including Ishtar, which Ishtar we're going to be getting to in the next couple of weeks out of the Bible. But then Nimrod disappeared, or Enmerker disappeared, who is Nimrod. It states that he defeated and killed troops, but did not leave a writing. He did not read a stele. Victors always left steles. He created writing. He didn't write anything down, and he didn't make a name for himself. So following this apparent failure, many bizarre creatures were created by the gods. No human army could conquer these creatures unless the gods gave approval. They're described as part human creatures with bird-like features. The Bible often uses birds for evil oppressors. We looked at that in the past in the parables. Birds represent evil oppressors, and these beings are represented as being bird-like. And they were very similar to the Rephaim in the Bible, among others. Great men throughout history, they've left obelisks, they've left stelae, they've left monuments. Nimrod left an unfinished ziggurat. But his activities led to evil beings and creatures being unleashed upon the people, left us with demons. These demons are the legacy of Nimrod. We have them today, and they're becoming bolder, and they're becoming more powerful. The more people are turning to them and worshiping them on a daily on a daily basis, and perhaps even more numerous today, although that's debatable. But with transhumanism and genetic modifications, we are doing our best as humans to pick up where Nimrod left off. We've created human-animal hybrids. We've created plant-animal hybrids. We've made man-machine hybrids. We're messing with things that we should not be messing with. The Sumerian legend of Enmerker tells us that he left no record and he disappeared. Nimrod invented writing, But when God changed his language, he had no way to leave anything intelligible. And when God dispersed them, he disappeared. Makes sense. Nimrod is responsible for the return of the Nephilim and the invention of false religions. And false doesn't mean made up, but the objects of worship are false gods in place of the true God. Everything from the first cults in Mesopotamia, many of which are still with us today in many different forms, but down to today's modern Freemasonry can be laid at the feet of Nimrod. However, the worst aspect of Nimrod's legacy is that he released the gods of the nations and those who were serving them. These lesser gods were then free to create their own cults and seduce their own people. And that's why there is so much spiritual confusion today. People are confused. And they're not simply just mixed up. They're being influenced by real supernatural beings who are opposed to everything that's godly. They are just terrorizing people. They're tormenting people. They are oppressing people. Everything that's moral and good, especially and including marriage, is what they're out to destroy, because those things are the foundations of humanity and civilization. And these attacks are going to continue, and they will grow stronger. As a result of the dispersion from Babel, Nimrod moved from Mesopotamia to Nineveh, which is in Assyria. Genesis chapter 10, verses 11 through 12 says, "Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city." Then in Micah 5:6, "And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian, when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our borders." So this Nimrod or Enmerker disappeared according to Sumerian legend. And in the passages we just read here, they both use the name Nimrod and the name Asher or the Assyrian. And the name Asher in this passage is not the descendant of Seth from Genesis 10:22, but it is Nimrod himself, who is now called the Assyrian. Yahweh scattered the people. Therefore, Yahweh moved Nimrod into Assyria, and that's why he is known as the Assyrian. In Isaiah 23:13, "Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, which is Babylon. This people was not till the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness, the Amorites. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought Tyre to ruin." This passage confirms his identity by showing the Assyrian did the same things as Nimrod elsewhere. We know that's the same person. They did the same things. And as we saw, there are three separate events that brought about the depravity of the world. And it's obvious when we put it all out in plain sight. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 shows two parts of the same story, one after another. It doesn't show two different accounts of the same event. They're different, and they're consecutive stories in which the same lesson has to be learned again by mankind. First, there's the creation, followed by God's warning and covenant with Adam, which is followed by the fall of man. This fall is demonstrated with the murder of Abel. Then man divides into family groups. They develop technological innovations that are given to them, and then they attempt to return to the divine status that was forfeited in the Garden of Eden. This was performed through interaction with the spiritual realm that brought about giants on the earth. God then intervenes to save humankind. And only 10 generations from Adam to Noah, depravity is complete, and man's effort to achieve his own glory on his own merit is rewarded with the destruction of all flesh. Then second, there's the renewal that is brought about by the flood. Once again, there's a warning and a covenant, this time with Noah. Noah's fall was a result of getting drunk on the fruit of the vine, which is similar to Adam's partaking in the garden. Through these events, Canaan is cursed, just like Cain. The names are even similar enough to make the connection. After this, the families branch out, and they account for all the nations and languages of the known world. There's one individual who discovered a technology or a means that allowed him to try to bring in the divine. Nimrod built Babel, and he brought giants back into the world. He also brought in worship of the fallen sons of God, which led to the division of the world as God's judgment. This also spans 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And Abraham is going to be the agent of change in the new world. We should see a pattern here. Mankind has a tendency toward depravity and corruption. Each time that tyrannical giants rose to power and threatened to destroy humanity, we went with it. God has intervened in this destruction before, and we're told that he's going to intervene again. Are you prepared for that? Are you living a life of faith? Are you telling others? And don't be discouraged, because sometimes God has prophets preaching in a desert. But if God tells you to preach in a desert, you go preach in the desert. If you want to understand the future, you have to look into the past. It is in the past where we can see where we are in history, and it's not pretty. It's quite scary. If we see the world's history as a series of cycles, then God's people can be prepared. We can see what needs to change, and we can see what we need to warn others about. We have to be faithful. Faithful requires work. We have to tell the world. The world's not going to listen. We're told that. But some people will. And those people need to hear.